It's the death that has turned America on its head. 8 minutes and 46 seconds as a man called out for his life.
It is very sad that now that you all see us and hear us, but at what cost at someone's death.
But out of the ashes,
united we stand, divided we fall.
A movement with voices from every color and creed calling for, demanding change.
There's a lot of power in what's going on right here.
As the fight to build a more perfect union,
the people united will never be defeated.
The fight to stomp out racial injustice and equality marches forward.
I believe it's the footwork to crossing the bridge into what the new norm is going to be.
It's time for real talk on racism.
Good evening, and thank you for joining us tonight. I'm Yolanda Harris.
I'm Tracy Townsend. You know, we really are at a moment where it seems the whole world is calling for change. And typically in these moments, you see the people who are in office or in leadership sit down and talk and talk. And so maybe things change, maybe they don't.
But here at 10 TV, we want to get to the heart of the issues, and that's why tonight is about the people. Over the next hour, we're sitting down with people in the community and asking them to share their experiences. It's about spurring honest conversation and shining the light on the root of racism.
And we're going to keep it real. You'll hear from people here in Columbus about what they think are some of the biggest issues for the Black community and how we can all work together to fix it.
But before we look to the future, it's important to look at the past. You may not know this, but Central Ohio played a critical role for slaves looking for a new life. Former 10 TV anchor Jerry Revish shows us the path.
The path to freedom ran right through Central Ohio. But it's more than the Underground Railroad and abolitionists. In fact, Black people were in Ohio before it even officially became a state.
People of African descent being in Ohio before 1803, before Ohio became a state, that's very true. I mean, we were here.
Dr. Chuck Walsh is the director of the National Afro-American Museum and Cultural Center located in Wilberforce, Ohio. The work of his group, along with the Ohio History Connection, was able to find evidence of Black life in Ohio all the way back to the late 1700s.
As an example, in our archival collection, we have the deeds of land in an area called Negro Town. Negro Town, which is located in Seneca County. Very well established Black community of former Revolutionary War veterans.
He says those historical finds are the very thing his group looks for to help educate the public. And there's a lot to discover. The roots of Black history in this state run deep.
Ohio's a hotbed of these really early African-American communities. As soon as the United States opened up, territory further west, especially this Northwest Territory, African-Americans were part of that diaspora that left the East Coast to come to this open territory.
In fact, one of the largest emancipations of enslaved people in U.S. history took place here.
These enslaved people were freed by their owner, who was here in the state of Ohio, and left them land. And they had to leave Virginia in order to get here and get this inheritance.
And while their names may not be in the history books, there are countless stories of inspirational Ohioans who made meaningful contributions to this nation. Meet Colonel Charles Young.
He's the third African-American to graduate from West Point. He's the original commander of the Buffalo Soldier units that we talk about historically. I mean, that's Charles Young. He's the original commander. He was the first African-American to serve as a National Park superintendent. This story is something that I think it should be required reading for everyone around the country because it fills every category of what America is supposed to be. One of the first housing projects in the country takes its name from Reverend Dr. James Poindexter. This individual, another one that just did tremendous things in his life, but he was a part of that Underground Railroad tradition, keeping the culture alive, and the things that they accomplished in the Columbus area. I'm still learning. Neighborhoods that I'm learning about, I didn't know that they were traditionally African-American neighborhoods that, through gentrification, now they look completely different, but they have such a long, rich history of African-Americans being there, creating these communities.
He hopes more people will seek out opportunities to learn about the contributions Black people made, not only in Ohio, but also throughout American history.
And we get the same stories, we get the same, hear the same speeches. And I always ask myself, is this the extent of it? I was so used to the 13 colonies and slavery and how it expanded from there, and we kind of focus a lot on that, but like, wait a minute, Ohio has some very deep, very rich history that nobody talks about.
Dr. Walsh barely scratched the surface. If you want to know more, you can check out the National Afro-American Museum and Cultural Center in Wilberforce, or the Ohio History Connection right here in Columbus. There's a lot to learn out there, guys. Back to you.
There most certainly is, Jerry. Please stay with us. Our community conversation begins next, and we start with the conversation every Black parent says they have to have with their kids.
I shouldn't have to fear for my life, fear for my safety when I'm around the police. I shouldn't have to worry about being the next one.
The message these parents want you to know.
They have not understood that everything was built by our hands, and that at that point, they ain't the toughest. We are. We on top, and always will be. I can't help, we got a little bit more melanin in our skin, so that does make a difference.
I knew I hadn't done anything wrong, but yet I was still terrified as the officer was asking me if I had owned the car I was driving, if I even lived in the house that I lived in, or the neighborhood that I lived in. 14 years I've lived in this community. I was afraid, but fortunately I was prepared. I knew it was happening. I have two uncles who are in law enforcement, and they had trained me for situations like the one I was in because my life depended on it.
When you think about having the talk with your children, you probably think sex education. But for African American parents, the talk takes on a different meaning. That young man you just heard from is my son Ian, and we certainly had the talk about what would happen if he was driving and there was an encounter with police, about how he needed to make it through that encounter. It's a conversation that almost every Black parent has with their son or their daughter. 10 TV's Angela Pace talked with community leaders about why.
The talk is that talk you have with every Black male child, explaining to them that they're a Black male in America. It's telling your son that you have to be cognizant of where you go, how long you stay there, and how you carry yourself while you're there. That as a Black male, you can't walk around the store with your hands in your pocket. You can't walk around with a hood on. That if your female friend is of another race, you have to be careful how you are intimately contacted with her and showing public affection in certain areas. You have to always look over your shoulder because you're every day reminded you're a Black man. I had to tell my son, who is 12, we were going into one of the stores here, and he had on a mask. He had his hoodie on, put his hood on, and put his hands in his pockets. And walking in the store, I had to say, take your hands out your pocket, pull the hoodie off. It's repetitious, take your hands out your pocket. I'm a 6'3", 200+ Black man, and you want me to put a mask on going in the store. It's not a second thought for white folk, but for a Black man with a Black son, it's always a second thought. But not only are our men being mishandled and misrepresented, our Black daughters are being handled and misrepresented. So let's not forget the treatment that they're receiving, because my daughter was mishandled by a police officer of Reynoldsburg, and I had to step in. That's why I go back to, it's something in a person that immediately when you see somebody by the color of their skin, you determine what the outcome is going to be.
So we all have to have that talk, which is really unfortunate. And I've said to my white friends, you don't have to have that talk with your boys.
Mm-mm.
You know, my son went to a private school here in Columbus. And you know, they do those senior days where they go and they, what is it, senior prank, whatever, and you take a water gun. And so his senior year, I remember him, I got up one morning, was fixing a cup of tea, and he came in around 6 o'clock. Black hoodie, black sweats, and one of those giant water guns. And I said, where have you been, right? And he said, we had senior prank. And I said, and where did you go do senior prank? And he said, New Albany. And I said, have you lost your mind? You're a black man in a hoodie, hiding behind somebody's bushes, waiting for them to come outside at 5 o'clock in the morning. I said, have you lost your mind? But because we have taught our kids not to see color, unfortunately, as a black man, I had to now say, look, you're 18 years old. You could have been shot. Somebody could have called or called the police because you were doing senior prank. So you're absolutely right. We have to have, when my son gets in a car, the first thing when he got his driver's license is if you get stopped, okay? Do not be like your mother, okay? Do not start talking trash to the police officer, right? Put your hand seriously on the steering wheel, right? Don't move until he, whatever. Why do we have to have that? Because I'll tell you right now, if something happens to mine, I will lose my reputation in this community. I promise you that. Because of some stop for no reason, because he's playing loud music, because he's driving a BMW, because we live in the neighborhood. We don't live in the suburbs, right? So because he may be mistaken for somebody, whatever reason, you know, we have to have that talk, and that's really unfortunate. And it's continuous. That's what's unfortunate. Why do we have to keep having this? Because of the people who are supposed to be protecting and serving us, not policing us, protecting and serving us. That our kids have to be afraid of police.
I had the first talk. One is 19 and one's 22, when they first got their cars, because you know they like to go out with their friends and so forth and have a good time, you know, hang out, and they go in neighborhoods like Upper Arlington, Grandview, maybe, or you know, East Side, wherever you go, Reynoldsburg, and my dad never had to talk with me. And so as a father, I had to make sure that my sons knew, because I've been stopped before, twice. And so what I taught them was always have your ID and stuff in the visor, the registration and everything. As soon as you get stopped, put it all on the dashboard, roll down your window, hold the wheel, and whatever he says, answer the question. Don't move, don't reach for nothing. And it's a frightening thing as a father. Now, as we look at the climate, is because I have to pray for my kids every night when they leave from work, because they work at UPS and FedEx. And they get off at 11 o'clock. And they're going home on 270. They may be hungry, they may be speeding to get home, got homework or something else, but I gotta pray every night for my boys. And I pray for all the kids that age that are driving, their friends. Because that's important to me, because when they come over, I'm just like, man, glad you guys, or when they leave my house, you know, I just say, hey man, be careful. Don't drive too fast. I gotta give them instructions. And I shouldn't have to do that. When the door opens at 12:30, I say, okay, I can really go to sleep.
I've had plenty of interactions with police officers who, you know, doubt kind of where I'm from, kind of my background. You know, when I went to law school, I went to Harvard Law School, and so I've been pulled over before, and people say, you really go here? Is that some, you know, all these sorts of doubts about who you are, and this constant belief of that you are the threat at any potential moment. I've had those interactions. I can't even count.
You know, we have a park directly across the street from our house. On this particular day, I was at the park with my 2-year-old son. And, you know, there was another, it was just us, and there was another white family that was at the park as well. And I know because I had stopped and we were chatting for just a minute, and they had a 4-year-old daughter. little blonde kind of white girl. And her and Junior were running around the park having a good time. So after about 20 minutes of all of us being at the park together, her parents were saying, okay, it's time for us to go home. And anybody who knows toddlers know, saying it's time to go home, it turned into a whole thing. So she's waterworks and she's all upset about how it's time to go home. And her dad is kind of like, hey, it's time to go home. So instead, she runs away from him and she comes to stand next to the toy that my son is playing with. It's this little ladder, And so he's 2 years old and I'm standing right next to him just to make sure he doesn't fall off. She comes and runs up behind him and her dad comes up and he's standing directly across from me. So we're both watching everything that's happening. And he says, okay, we'll back up a little bit, give him some space. And he kind of like tries to move her backwards and she says, no. She starts to like climb. And so her dad grabs her and he's like, hey, back up. She loses it. She just starts crying and crying. And her dad's like, what's wrong? What's wrong? And so then she said, he kicked me. And she looks at my son and she says, he kicked me. Now, she's 4. My son is 2, right? So he barely even knows what's going on. And she says, he kicked me. He kicked me. So at first, her father says, no, he didn't. Don't say that. Don't say that. Because we were both standing right there. So we saw everything that happened. Right. And so he said, no, he didn't. Don't say that. And she keeps on. He kicked me. He kicked me. He kicked me. So at first you could see her father is embarrassed because, we both knew what had happened. But eventually he leads his daughter off. And when he is leading her off, I hear him as he walks off. Well, he didn't mean to. Well, he didn't mean to. Right? And so in that moment, what I was thinking about was, okay, if this was 10 years from now, this was 12 years from now, this was my 14-year-old black son, and this was your 16-year-old white daughter, and she says, he did this to me, even though we both saw exactly what happened, right? What she learned just then was if I cry hard enough, and if I point to somebody who I think the grown-ups will assume is culpable, I can get away with it. I literally was thinking about in that moment, the fact that I have to start thinking about my little black child at 2 years old. At 2 years old, I have to be thinking about my little black child.
It's so painful to think about because it places the burden of staying safe on the individual and in some cases, sadly, the victim on, them trying to, act as respectable as one can and don't talk back or don't do any of that stuff. When you're in a situation, just survive and move on and move through it. And it's sad that we have to have that talk with so many young black children in this country, but we're not having enough talk and action on putting in place accountability so that people aren't put in those dangerous situations.
Still to come.
So sometimes when people are saying the system is broken, the system ain't broken. The system is working just the way it was designed to work.
Breaking down systemic racism. What is it and how it exists in our society?
There really is no such thing. You know why? This is white. You know any folk look like that? No, of course not. So anyway, I think we need to give credit where credit is due. And the privileged have tried for a good 2,000 years to remove any notion of black African input into the cultural development of the human family.
Systematic racism is a thing. It's very prevalent. It's something that we need to really acknowledge. And it's not something that's going to go away overnight.
You got to look at it as it being a chain, a long chain that's just being constantly going and being added on, and somewhere that we have to break that chain.
Several terms have come up since the George Floyd murder, and they're terms that Black America is accustomed to, but terms that are just now becoming known to the mainstream. One of them, systemic racism. Yes. Tell us what that is.
Of course. I hear this a lot, and I think a lot of people are now saying it, and not everybody is necessarily knowing what they're talking about when they say the word. Basically, systemic racism refers to a system of laws, policies, practices, and norms that confer benefits on one group, racial group, above another. And so here in this society, it's been conferring laws and benefits on whites and giving them the opportunity to build wealth and an opportunity to really have all the benefits of laws in society, at the disadvantage and in direct contrast to other groups, blacks and black Americans, especially in our society. That's what we see. And so you have this dominant society of, you had laws like you had institutions of slavery, you had laws like Jim Crow and redlining. All that was designed to privilege whites and white society. And then there was a lot of resource extraction, exploitation of black people. And so that's why you see things like the racial wealth gap. That's why you see the outcomes we see today, is because these racist acts, of discriminatory acts in the past, continue to permeate in our institutions today. And so you can't look at the inequality and despair that you see at certain people in and say, that has nothing to do with our history. It does. It's bigger than any one individual law, any one individual person or policy. It is a system of structures that's designed to keep certain people above and other people's behind.
I went to Duke University in North Carolina, and I remember going onto campus, and there are a couple things that I take away from that experience. First and foremost, I didn't have a black professor until my junior year, but every single person who cleaned my dorm and served food in the cafeteria my freshman year were black. And the other thing that, really struck me as I was learning about how racism works in very insidious ways, not just about the people who would call me the N-word, but about the institution that said we are committed to diversity but doesn't have any black professors and has all cafeteria workers. That's also racism. That's systematic racism, because their heart, supposedly, according to all their brochures, was pure. And yet here we were, right, still looking at this. And I remember, folks asking me, or straight up saying, white kids, do you get here because of affirmative action? Did you get here because of affirmative action? I was like, first of all, my grades were probably better than yours. That's number one. But number two, and if I did? Because one of the things about not knowing our history, and when some folks say, I hear a lot this kind of refrain of like, go back to Africa. And I'm like, my people built this country. Literally on their backs built this country. So like, I'm not just from Africa, I'm from here. So it's really important for me when we talk about what it looks like to face ourselves. If I did get into Duke because of affirmative action, because for 400 years, your people own my people, I'll take that too. And I'll get this grade, and I'll get this degree, and I'll go on to get that job.
Certain people think that, well, if you have white privilege, then somehow it means you haven't faced any sort of disadvantage or burden. That's not what it means. It means that despite all of the disadvantages and burdens that you might have faced, and you might have lived a hard life, whatever it might be, you still are privileged based on the color of your skin and how society treats you because of that. And so that's white privilege. It's this idea that you're conferred certain benefits and benefits of the doubt in many cases that others are not conferred upon, and that's a privilege. It's also something for people to don't take that defensively. It's something for people to recognize their own privilege. I recognize the privileges that I have, certain privileges of my own background. I think you look at things like not only race, but you look at things like our system of patriarchy in this society, and sexism and all those types of things, certain privileges that men get over others. You see all these types of privileges based on how our society casts a light on these identities. And I think it's important for us to recognize those privileges and realize that my lived experiences are different than yours. I may disagree with certain things you believe in, but what I can't do is say that your story isn't your story. And I think we need to have more empathy in people to listen to that and recognize that and listen to their lived experiences.
Coming up, if your knowledge of Black history is limited to slavery and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., you're not alone. Up next, the calls to expand Black history in our schools. And still to come, leveling the playing field when it comes to economic access.
Give everybody a fair chance at accessing money. I'm a small business owner myself. We all need equal access to finances, to bank loans. We all need equal access to education.
Black excellence is real. I know a lot of times people think that Black culture is just like gangs or basketball players, but we are a lot more than that.
Ohio became a state in 1803, yet African Americans had largely been written out of the history. But how could you have been here building before it became a state, been here building as it became a state, been here and building since it's become a state, yet not be as represented in the history and the culture as really are?
Let's talk about kids. Do our children know enough about our history to understand the genesis of what we're seeing right now?
Black history is a page or a chapter, whereas U.S. history is a whole year. And oftentimes we who are parents have to intentionally expose our children and teach our children our history so that they will have their own pride about who they are and the contributions that people of color have made to this country.
Because we were founded on contradictions. You can't talk about everyone being created equal and then having people who were enslaved. I mean, there's all these sorts of contradictions that exist in our history. And maybe we talk about these issues, we pave over our history lessons in our schools. That's something that our school districts, we need to be teaching this history. And this is not propaganda or anything like that. This is telling us the real history of what this is. I mean, we're here in the city of Columbus. We've got these Christopher Columbus statues, right? I mean, we are talking about a history of brutality and violence. And it is only folks who want to remain ignorant to that history and to say that, we're innocent along the way, or that happened so long ago, it shouldn't matter now. No, it does matter. It didn't just happen. Slavery, Jim Crow, civil rights, Obama gets elected. That's not how things work, right? So much more goes into this history, and Black Americans have played a fundamental role to that, as well as other marginalized groups. And I think it's important for people to recognize that that's our history. All of that together, that's American history. It's not just one version, one set of events, but everybody together makes up our history, the ugly and the good.
Honestly, I think there's a group of people that want to know. There's a group of people that don't want to know. Because then you have to look at yourself in the face. And then you have to make a choice once you learn about the history and how things have evolved over the years for African Americans and Black and brown people, period. And I think that that's something people don't want to really face because, even though it's a long time ago for some, it's still not a long time ago for us because we're still dealing with the same mess that we've been dealing with for the last 401 years. And it still hurts.
But when you look at who is deciding, who's writing the books, who's telling the stories, who produces the TV shows. Look, let's talk about Channel 10. No, seriously, who's deciding what gets to be put on the air? All of that storytelling, it's people from the majority community. So when they are the folks who are dictating how the story is told, they can only tell it from their lens. And if they don't have a Black person or an Asian person who can bring that diversity to the table, you're only going to see it from that lens. And so to your point, am I mad? No. But what I do want to have, if we really are talking about inclusion, and see, I'm tired of all the diversity and inclusion talk because that don't do nothing for me around. I want to talk about, if you really want to know about Black people, then you have to have Black people sitting at the table. Right. You can't have somebody else to say, use it, because when you use diversity and inclusion, everybody wants to include everything else in there as opposed to saying Black. So if you want to know about Black history, then you have to have Black people. If you want to make sure that you don't put something on the air or say something derogatory, if you have a Black person sitting next to you that you have a relationship with, they're going to be like, maybe hold up a little bit. Like that H&M, when they did that shirt, but they had the little black boy, the little monkey on the shirt, black. Yeah. You didn't have no Black people sitting, because if you had somebody Black sitting there, they would have said, I think you need to stop. I don't think you want to do that. So I think until folks really value what we bring to the table, if you really want to understand our story, then you have to take the time to know somebody that's Black, to actually know them, and to be able to have a relationship with them so that they can help you understand what you don't know. And I'm okay if you don't know. But what I will say this is, we had to learn about white history, okay? So I'm not gonna keep giving you every book, say, go read this and go read. I need you to go do the same due diligence and initiatives that I had to do in order for me to get where I'm at today.
But there are a lot of people who just don't know this history. And I think the more you talk about these issues, the more you tell them the truth of it, it opens their eyes, because it not only sets the foundation for where we've been, but it can also make sure that we have the foundation of where we can go from here.
From education to the economy.
Pull yourself up by your bootstraps, and you need to do this and you need to do that. And I said, what happens if you don't have boots? If this country took your boots away?
That's right.
You ain't got no straps, you ain't got no laces, you ain't got no boots. You know, so as soon as this country gives me some boots, I will get to my bootstraps.
That's right.
But I'm still waiting on my boots.
A look at the struggle just to get started.
If we forgive more and we have more understanding, and we like everybody, we're not prejudiced.
So you talked about trauma, and the word rage was mentioned earlier, and a lot of the rage, Black America says, comes from inequities. So it's inequities, socioeconomic inequities, inequities in education, cultural inequities. Is that justified?
Those disparities are alive and well. COVID-19 has just exacerbated those disparities, those inequities that already existed. It is unfortunate that where your zip code is, what zip code you live in, does dictate your health. Health disparities. You look at in our city, we have the number of babies that are black baby deaths every year is higher than some of our national and state averages. When you look at the incarceration rate of African American men, when you look at during COVID-19, when the courts opened up on June 1, there were over 1,300 evictions, people in the queue for evictions, primarily African Americans. When you look at the number of homeless families in this community, I think it's over 70% of them are African Americans.
In 2020, we're still saying the first generation of college persons. In 2020, we're still saying in many of our households, this is the first college graduate. We're still fighting a system that keeps us in our place, to say, where someone else can get a 4-year degree and get a job. I have to get the master's to get the job. It may not be said, it's not written, but it's understood.
I used my money when I got out the Gulf War to purchase this building. I put my deposit down. The owner happened to be African American, and he gave me a chance. Had it been somebody else, would I have the chance to be here and be here as long as I have and make the impact that I have in this community and across the city? Probably not. But I just thank God for somebody to give us a chance.
That history tells us why African American and indigenous people and other people of color, why there is a wealth gap, right? Because they drove highways down our community. 71 was driven down a thriving black community.
That I lived in.
Right.
That's right.
During that time, yeah.
That's right.
Right. I think it starts with building trust with the financial institutions and higher up, because a lot of times they would always give an opportunity to somebody who is white. They'll give more of an opportunity than we would. We got to have our credit at the highest level, but theirs could be at the bottom, because they look at them and say they got potential, even if they mess it up. We got to constantly work. We can't mess it up. So we only get one shot to get it right, and then once that one shot, if we don't get it right, everybody else ain't getting a shot, just because you made one mistake.
So it's like a domino effect.
It's a domino effect in the community.
It shouldn't be left down to that one person who said, I'm gonna give you a chance, right? Because even thinking about what we don't know, I don't know why it is, but we do know why it is. Because our country was built on the idea around, white wealth being prioritized above all else.
So You know, what we've got to start doing is taking a look at what's going on, those disparities in this community, that, you know, we're not a big city like Chicago or New York or Los Angeles where everybody wants to talk about them because we're Columbus and people still don't give us, but we have a lot of inequities and economic disparities. And I will say this, why is it that 102 years later, the Columbus Urban League's work is far more important than it was when we were first put into play? The Columbus Urban League was formed to deal with what? Housing inequities, to deal with jobs, to deal with education. And here we are 102 years later, and we are still in operation, and even more so now than ever. We have to make sure that black folks have not just minimum wage jobs, livable wage jobs. We have to make sure that we have housing stabilization programs so people are not evicted. We're making sure that our young black boys have access to mentors so that they can remain in school. We have, you know, programs for ex-offenders who are coming out of jail, who can't have IDs, who don't have housing. We have to deal with drug and alcohol abuse and issues still in the black community. So here we are 100 years later, still in the same place as we were when the Urban League was started. That really is an indictment on this community and how resources have not been put in the black community. Yeah, people say they serve black people, but the reality is, are you really serving them?
And guess who fills up the void for those who don't go through the process or don't make it? The church, the black church.
I'm going to be fighting for these issues, but I can't do it alone.
We've talked about the problems. Up next, we look ahead to the solutions.
So what do we do now? How do we make sure that this moment is more than a moment?
Vote. Register and vote, and then hold those we elect accountable. Oftentimes, many of those who are elected officials, they get elected and they forget about the people who elected them. There's some elected officials now that I will not name that I know this community hadn't seen in a while. They see them on TV, they see them in a picture on Facebook, but they don't. When I was a teenager, the African-American elected officials were people you could walk up to and talk to. You saw them in the community every day. And they were held accountable. And it's time for us to begin to hold those who we elect accountable.
All police are not bad, we know that. And when there is a level of respect there. But when you talk about police in the black community, it's about policing us, as opposed to in the white communities, police protect and serve. And so for black people, what they want to know is that we have put policies and procedures in place for police to hold them accountable to protect and serve us. So it's all about accountability. We're looking for something that's transformative with the police department. Does a review, independent review committee need to be put into place? Absolutely. Do we need to have a registry for when there is a police officer who's used excessive force, that they get put on the registry and that they can't move around to other police departments? Absolutely. Do we need to make sure that everybody's wearing their body cam, their body cameras are on, so that when there is an incident, they know that there's something that's recording them? Absolutely. So I think those are the kinds of things that black folks are looking for.
So I think that what needs to happen is that we need to see an action, and then we can have a conversation and say, all right, now let's talk about how that action worked or it didn't work. Let's talk about how that reform worked or didn't work, and let's continue to workshop it together. But until I see an action, there doesn't need to be any more conversation. So I really feel like part of this needs to be, making sure that our leaders are held accountable for not just showing up and not just gestures, but for real change and real actions that actually impact the issues that we're discussing.
Are we looking at our institutions here locally to say, okay, who has been exemplary in knocking barriers down? When we look at the makeup of the corporations around town, are they diverse? And I'm not just talking about, those people that are working there, but on their boards or in their C-suites. When we're looking at our school district and our school system, what kind of resources are actually being put into play for those children who are already disadvantaged. When we look at dollars that are coming out from the feds for our neighborhoods, how do we make sure that those dollars are going into those neighborhoods? So I'm talking about sustainable, accountable, measuring something, some kind of tool that, 2 years from now, we can come back to the community and somebody's got to report out and say, in 2022, in 2020, we said we were going to do this, and here we are in 2022, and we did this, this, and this.
But we need to have people in there that really care about us and this issue. And I understand, you get contributions from this and that, but we matter too. We matter too. We're the ones that are going to put you in. You're going to come by the shops and come in our community for a day and visit. Hey, it's all good, but we want to see some change, some real change. And what that change look like, you see these street lights working. You see these businesses getting better. You pouring money back into the neighborhoods that are distressed, that you let go down because you moved your dollars somewhere else or you built a stadium. Let's talk about that. We need to see real change right here in the neighborhood.
When we look at these issues of inequality and despair, while certainly people can focus on individual circumstances and where people, come from and their own backgrounds and things like hard work and responsibility, we have to talk about those narratives and how those narratives can be problematic. And instead, we need to focus on providing shared prosperity for everybody. Stop blaming people for their circumstances or policing their behavior or policing them in general. Just stop blaming people on their circumstance and instead focus on what can we do as a society, the wealthiest nation on earth, to provide opportunities for people to live and thrive in this country.
Don't underestimate us. We just have fun, we do what we want, and we just live our best lives.
Not all black people are mean. Understand what we do, because some people don't get to know what we do. And like she said, all black people is not hurtful or mean or none of that.
The conversations we had tonight are just the tip of the iceberg. And while we know some things may be hard to hear, it's a conversation worth having.
And we also know that even with everything said tonight, it still won't change how some people feel. But we hope that this past hour will at least encourage you to listen to your neighbors, even if you don't agree. Thanks for watching.
They have to have those conversations with folks that may seem small. Like when they're at the dinner table, you have to be able to stand up to your family members who are also, maybe feel differently than you. And you have to be willing to, lose some folk.
This needs to be a literal shift in history.
We have all different walks of life. I think this is now becoming more of a universal issue right here, where people are understanding that a change needs to happen.
Making history, look at us, look at how many people are out here.
I want the same things that white America wants. My family wants the same thing. I want a great education for my child. I want to live in a wonderful neighborhood. I want to have a wonderful job that I can earn money and keep a roof over my head, and something that I love and I'm passionate about. I want to go on vacation like you do, right? I want to go to Saks like you do. I know I'm being but I want the same things you want.
In the 60s, they used to hold up a sign, "I am a man." I am a man. I want white America to know that we are humans just like you are, created in the image of the divine, with gifts and talents and resources that help this country be what she is today. And don't ever forget that.
If you have not experienced something that somebody else has experienced based on how society views them because of their color of skin, I don't want charity. I don't want pity. But what I do want to see is solidarity. I want to be able to see people to say, I may not be able to recognize your full experiences, but I'm not going to close my ears to the injustices that I see. I'm not going to close my eyes to what's around me and think that your account of history and your experiences are wrong and you shouldn't be talking about these issues. I want you to talk about these issues because that is what makes us great. That's what makes us as good citizens of the world, to say that I may disagree or I may not understand the full scope of things, but at the very least, I do want to be on the right side of history and fight for racial justice.
We bleed the same blood that you bleed. Know your history is most important thing right now. And like my sister said, join the movement and be a part of the change that you want to see in this country.
We can put all the policies and procedures in place, but until a person searches their own soul about how they view others, you can't change them.
Welcome to the movement. We're glad you're here. Now sit down, do your homework, catch up with the rest of us, and we can march forward together.